Hey guys, this is video for Friday, February 21st. We have class period 4. And what we're looking for today is we're going to look at one of the papers you just did. And we're going to do some feedback on that. Just help if I shared my screen instead of doing that. Okay, there we go. So we're going to look at this thing here, which we did on February 13th. Currently, I have it from Gary, Haley, Brad, and Megan, all of the HL students for some odd reason. What that means is that they do not have to do what we're doing today. They could, obviously, I want you to listen, but I don't need you to do the assignment. And what the assignment will be to complete the paper based on what I'm talking about and send it to me. So I'll need Danny, Alvin, Leon, and Pachatana to send it to me. Obviously, everyone should pay attention, make sure that you've got everything. I sent you some notes on your papers as well. Yeah. So we'll go through the paper one and kind of go from there, okay? So this is the question. This is actually the marking scheme as well. So the first question that I gave you guys, which was explain possible negative externalities explain the possible negative externalities that might arise from the increased use of cars. Okay, so we're talking about a negative externality of consumption, right? The use of cars. We're not talking about the production of cars, we're talking about the use of cars. So first step is we've got is deeds, right? So I have our diagram here in a second. Deeds, right? We're doing deeds, right? So the first thing we need to do is to get rid of that D. We'll cross it out because we're doing it right now. Definitions. We're getting rid of definitions, right? Because we're doing it right now. Okay, so definition. Okay, so our definitions are going to be, as you can see here, definitions of externalities, negative externalities, and externalities of consumption. Do you need all of them? No. You could just talk about negative externality. If you just define negative externality of consumption, you would be perfectly fine. I think you could also just briefly define the term market failure, and you could define the term market failure and negative externality of consumption. So market, I'm writing this on our board here, failure and negative externality of comp. Okay, so define market failure and negative externality of comp. Okay, so our next step on our deeds is going to be to explain. So we are going to cross off our next D. Actually, we don't need the S yet because we're not there. And we need to look at this, right? Okay, so we need to explain. So we need to explain the possible consequences of this. So the possible consequences of increased use of cars is going to be that there is an increase in air pollution due to the fact that the marginal private benefit and the marginal social benefit are different, right? The marginal private benefit is greater than the marginal social benefit. Therefore, there's going to be an overconsumption, there's going to be an over allocation of resources, and there's going to be a price that's below the socially optimal level, where marginal social cost equals marginal social benefit. So because marginal social cost does not equal marginal social benefit, because these do not equal each other, we've reached a point where we aren't producing at a good level, a socially optimal level. So an example of this would be that obviously there are places we could talk about. Beijing. There's a lot of cars in Beijing. The more cars that are out on the roads, the more air pollution, the more noise pollution, the more there's actually a lot of rubber that's produced by the use of cars as well. You see it on the sides of the road, like pieces of rubber. So you can talk about that. You're not talking about a solution to this yet. You don't want to overdo the question because you're not doing that on this question. But just give some examples of that. You can talk about India and the overuse of cars there as well. And the biggest part of this answer is going to be your diagrams, right? So we've done the next, we've done the next E. Done the next E, done. Okay, so this is what, sorry, I'm trying to resituate. All right, so this is the graph that you should have. So what you've got here is you've got a supply line, you've got a marginal social benefit line, and then you've got a marginal private benefit line. Because we're not operating at the marginal social benefit, we're not operating at the optimum area, we're operating at the private area. So we're, instead of consuming at Q optimum here, we're consuming at Q star here. As a result, there is this dead weight loss, which is here. This could be a term that you define. This dead weight loss, the gap between where private individuals are going to consume and marginal social benefit, where we should be consuming the optimum position. That externality gap, that dead weight, the dead weight loss is the amount of inefficiency within this market. And what our goal is going to be that our goal here is to try to reduce this negative externality, so that we can get to a point where marginal social cost can eventually equal marginal social benefit. So this is the point. So this would actually be up here. Social cost line or supply line. This is where we're going to try to get to, okay? So this is your part A. The thing with it, A, what you don't want to do is you don't want to overdo it. It's a 10-point question. It should take you about 15 minutes, and you should move on. You don't want to overdo this question. You would talk a lot about this, but you don't want to get too crazy, okay? This is what you should be included. Once you've included it, move on. Don't overdo it, okay? Part B. Discuss the policy options that a government could use to reduce negative externalities that might arise from the increased use of cars. Okay, so this time the B is connected to the A. So how do we fix it? How do we fix this? Okay, so we still should be following a deeds diagram model. So we're still talking about negative externalities. So you could define that again or just reference it. But what you're more going to be defining is potential solutions to this particular problem. So make sure you're in B, you're defining as you go. Define whatever comes through, okay? So we've defined our terms. We're going to explain some potential solutions. Governments might decide to tax the buying of cars. They might decide to tax gasoline. They might decide to implement a limit on the amount of driving. An example would be in Mexico City, depending on your license plate, you can only drive on certain days. So if you have like an odd number on your license plate, you drive on Monday, or you drive every other day, right? So it just rotates. Certain cars can drive on certain days. The reason why they do this is so that people will carpool and stop driving every day or take public transportation. They do this in Shenzhen by limiting what cars can be on what parts of the road. Unless you have a Shenzhen license plate, you can't go to certain places. You can't park in certain places unless you have a Shenzhen license plate, and that's to limit the amount of cars that drive from Guangzhou to Shenzhen. So these are ways to limit. These are examples you could be giving throughout your answer. And then you're going to diagram this, right? So our goal here on this graph is to reduce the externality. Our goal here is to move the private benefit closer to the social benefit. So we need to change this in some way. So depending on what you choose, your graph will look a little bit different. So let's say that we decide, hold on, I'm gonna have to erase. I'm gonna pause this real quick. Sorry, I had to pause. I was talking about a tax, and then I drew a line on demand line, which is the wrong thing to do, so don't do that. So if we decide to tax the consumption of the use of cars in some way, it could be through gasoline, it could be through buying a car, whatever we decide, we could potentially shift the marginal social cost line upward, and it would then reduce the quantity of cars consumed to a more optimum level, which would be reduce or completely eliminate the externality. You could also decide to shift the marginal private benefit line, or you could shift the marginal social benefit line by like educating the population. There's a couple different options here as to how to do it. It's up to you to kind of decide. You could look at your book to kind of decide which answer you want to go with. I provided some feedback for you guys on that if you need it. So you could also you could graph a subsidy as well. You could talk about putting in policies such as like carpool rules or changing emission standards for cars, so making cars more efficient by subsidizing the production of cars. You could do things. There's tons of different things. It's up to you completely how you decide to do it. Use examples from what you're used to. Okay, so the last thing in this answer is going to be the evaluation, right? So let's evaluate it. So evaluation of cars. So, sorry, just trying to move some things. Okay, so pros The first thing would be pros, cons. So what are the pros and what are the cons? What are the positives? What are the negatives of your solution? So we decide to tax, okay? Well, what are the positives of taxation? What are the negatives of taxation? The positives is that we're going to reduce the externality, meaning that people are going to consume less, or potentially it's just going to be more expensive for them to consume. Well, the cons of this are, well, what if you need your car to get to your job and you're making it more expensive for people who really don't have a lot of money? So you could potentially talk about that. Long-term versus short-term. So how is your policy going to work in the first couple months? How is it going to work in the long term? Are there any differences between them? If you tax in the short term, it might work, but in the long term, you can't continue to tax forever. So how do you fix that? Do you then use the money you generate from the tax to educate the population or invest in new technology? How do you deal with it? What do you do in the long term to fix this problem? Because you can't tax something in the long term. Okay. So what is the opportunity cost? What are we giving up? What are we? What are things that we are giving up to make this decision? Now, if we're talking about a tax, it's not as much of an opportunity cost, but if you talk about a subsidy, if you're talking about investing in development of some sort of technology, then there is an opportunity cost. So if you need to talk about opportunity costs, you should. What about other solutions? What other solutions are there? You should at least mention them. Now, you only really need to focus on one major one, but you should mention that you understand that there aren't other options. You need to mention that there are other options and focus on one. And maybe say why you chose not to do the other options, okay? Or you could combine two. So like if you were doing taxation, then you might want to decide to talk about education. And then another really big one is stakeholders. So who's going to be impacted? Usually it's consumers, producers, and the government. Those tend to be the main stakeholders in any decision. And then finally, conclusion summary. So usually this evaluation will be a page or 2 pages. It will be quite long. So at the end of it, you need to summarize what you do, and you need to make sure you clearly answer the question. You need to make sure you clearly answer the question in the last few sentences. So the question is, discuss economic policy options that the government could use to reduce negative externalities that arise from the use of cars. So you need to make sure that you clearly answer that question by restating the question in the last section so that the grader sees that and they're like, oh, they've really focused on it. They really understand what the answer to the question is. So when you're going through your test and you're thinking about when you're answering it, you need to think, have I done pros and cons? Okay, check, done that. Have I done long-term, short-term? Yes, good. Am I doing an opportunity cost? Do I need to mention it? I don't know, maybe I don't need to mention it. But have you thought about it? And then what else is there? And then who is going to be impacted? Consumers, producers, and then the government, right? And then finally, restate your stuff. These are the things you kind of need to, I don't know if you want to write it on your test or in the little planning section or whatever it is, you need to think about this when you're doing it. you need to kind of go through in your head, or if you're not a go through in the head kind of person, you need to write it down. Okay. Um, so you need to make sure that you're getting that, you get that down. Okay. Um, I think that's it for now. Hopefully that was helpful. Remember, if you did the test already previously and you sent it to me and you got your feedback, then you don't need to worry about doing today's assignment. Just make the changes to your test that I asked you to, and that's fine. You don't even need to send it to me. It's okay. For those of you who did not do the paper in the past, which was Danny, Alvin, Leon, and Pachana, you need to do this and get it to me, and also try to catch up. Monday, the current goal for Monday is to do some IA work. So I'll be emailing you guys some stuff on IAs as well. If you need anything, let me know. I hope all is well, and I will talk to you guys later. Bye.